Welcome to the Honest Reflection Podcast with your hosts, Cody Hairston and Nick Woods. Here, we want to help you reflect on your week and be honest about your relationship with God. We hope you enjoy this episode. Hey guys, glad to have you in our conversation again this week. Nick is with us as per usual. How's it going, Nick?
Good. It's good to be with you again. We're going to continue reflecting on how we can live in a way that the fruit of the Spirit can be seen in us. And specifically, we're going to continue this week our conversation reflecting on goodness. So if you've missed any of our previous episodes, of course, you can find them on Apple and Spotify. And if you like what we're doing, as always, you can give us a rating or subscribe, and that helps us out and helps others find us. Today, we're going to continue reflecting on living goodness, specifically with our neighbor. So we're going to think about some things like, what does it mean to be good to someone else? Where does our goodness come from? And ultimately, we're going to see that we need to do first right by others and let that guide our actions. So Cody's going to get us going today by recounting the story of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah, the Good Samaritan story is in Luke 10. Classic story, a story that people probably know. In fact, we've used it on this podcast before. But just to kind of recap what happens there, you got a man who's traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he's essentially jumped on his travels. Some people come, they beat him up, and they leave him on the side of the road, leave him for dead. Like he's going to die if he just stays over there. And in the story, Jesus tells him that a priest sees this man on the side of the road. A priest, that's a very religious person, working in the temple and whatnot, somebody who you would expect to do the right thing. He sees him on the side of the road. He walks by. Then a Levite comes up, similar type of person, religious person, somebody you would expect to be good. He sees this man on the side of the road, but he also just walks on by. And then a Samaritan sees him on the side of the road, not somebody with the same type of religious clout as the other two. He sees this man, and he actually stops. He stops and he takes care of him. Now, the Good Samaritan story is a classic example of kindness and love, two traits that we've already talked about, right? Because, the original question is who is my neighbor? You're trying to figure out who is it that you're supposed to show love to, and the Samaritan is the example of that. But he's also an example of kindness, right? Because he goes on, he puts him on his own animal. He takes him to an inn. And then even says, hey, look, I'll take care of the rest. Like, I got to go somewhere, because the Samaritan was traveling. He says, I got to go somewhere. Whatever other, costs are incurred by you, I'll take care of it when I come back. And so there's tons of kindness here. But as we've been talking about, Nick, this is also an example of the Samaritan's goodness too. So why don't you highlight his goodness in the story?
Yeah, I think in teaching about loving your neighbor here, Jesus actually starts with showing us two people who not only didn't love their neighbor, but maybe they were missing something in their character. Maybe they weren't filled up with what it means to really be good, to do right by somebody. That's what we talked about in our last episode, that like this concept of goodness is really about doing right by other people and what that looks like. And so when you look at the Levite, when you look at the priest, they walk by, and it said, and in both cases it says they saw him, and this person that they saw, he had been left half dead, the text says in the New American Standard. And so then you see the Samaritan, and he comes by, and he said, and the text says when he saw him, he felt compassion. And I think what we want to say is like that feeling, that compassion is part of it. That's part of goodness. That's his conscience. That's him seeing a situation and wanting to do something about it. And then verse 34 says, and he came to him. All right, that's goodness. He stopped his journey and he came to him. He did the right thing. Leaving a person to die on the side of the road is never the right thing to do. And of course, as we understand this, Jesus is telling this as a parable, right? Like he's telling us this story to define who our neighbor is. But from a greater standpoint, what Jesus also does is he shows what it means to be good. By simply stopping to help, the Samaritan shows his heart, and his conscience is pulling him to do right by the injured person. He felt compassion. And then, we talked about this, and Cody mentioned the kindness, paying for his stay and his needs further. He's showing his charity, his kindness that we talked about last month. And so you see kind of both sides of this. And we see a great example, I think, of what love encompasses, what that we're really supposed to be bearing out. But when you see this story, I do think you see somebody doing right by somebody. So goodness then is the moral compass that is rooted in what is right in any situation.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about our neighbors, that's where it begins. Is, hey, what does my moral compass say to do here? What does my conscience say? What is the good and the right thing to do? I love the story because I mean it is the good Samaritan, right? Not the kind Samaritan, not the loving Samaritan. So I think we do recognize that there's goodness here, but you just see the inner workings of all the fruit of the spirit, right? You see how love and kindness and goodness work together. We've already talked about how you can use kindness to generate goodness, how being kind, being charitable can produce the right thing in a situation. But here you're kind of seeing it the other way around. So the Samaritan's goodness is what caused him to stop, because stopping for this man was just the right thing to do. And that's what opens up the door for all of the kindness and the charity that comes later on. So I think if we can get the goodness part down, it's for us, it will open up the door for our love, for our joy, for our patience and kindness and all the good things that we're supposed to do too. But when I think about goodness, one point that I try to remember for myself, but of course when I'm teaching as well, is that goodness is not an intellectual thing. It being good, doing good is not it's not just thinking the right things. And I know we can get really wrapped up in the fact that we quote unquote we know all the right things. We have the right ideas about whether it's certain doctrine, certain teachings. We think the right things and we think, okay, well that makes me good. Well, in this story, I mean, if anybody knows the right things, it's the Levite and the priest, right? These are the law keepers, the people working in the temple, right? I mean, these are the folks who they know their stuff. They have a lot of the right thinkings on some of the teachings and whatnot. I even think if you were to ask them, hey, is stopping to help someone good? They probably would have said yes. But then when they came into a situation where they needed to stop for someone, they didn't, because they knew what it meant to be good, but they weren't actually good themselves. And so that's just it's an important distinction. We've got to get moved from just thinking the right things to, hey, I am the right kind of person. I do the right kind of things. David is another great example of this. This is a man after God's own heart. Well, when the prophet Nathan comes to him and he tells him this story, this is in the aftermath of David taking Bathsheba, that's Uriah's wife. Nathan tells him this parable, of this guy who's taken other people's sheep, right? He tells it in a way where you can tell who the bad guy is in the story. You can tell who's not doing good stuff. And David's up in arms when he tells the story. He's like, "Oh yeah, I mean, we need to do something about this because this person's not good." And then Nathan says, "But you're the man," right? Because David knew what it meant to be good, but he wasn't being good in that moment. Now, of course, David repents, and I think you see the goodness that comes out there too. But it's easy to think good things, but goodness is seen in what we do and who we are. And so I think at some point we just have to stop if we're really trying to be good and trying to bear this fruit of the spirit. At some point when it comes to our neighbors, we have to stop and say, am I doing right by my neighbor right now? Regardless of what the scenario might be. We have to stop and say, hey, what is the good and right thing to do for this person that I'm around right now? Because the Levite and the priest, they didn't ask that question. I think had they asked that question, they would have stopped, right? They would have done something good. Maybe they assumed that they were right. But for us, we have to ask that question when it comes to our neighbors, to people that we're coming into contact with. Man, who or am I doing right by my neighbor? And we need to let God be the one to answer that question as well.
Yeah, I mean, if we're not going back to God's goodness, right, then we're missing the point of who we're trying to be transformed into in the first place. Jesus came to show us God's goodness. Jesus even answered when he was called a good teacher. He said, "No one is good but the Father." And so that is our standard. And so when we're asking that question, am I doing right by someone? Am I doing right by my neighbor? God is God is the standard. And Jesus teaches that way. This view of goodness, doing right by others, is actually integral to the way that Jesus taught and rebuked the Pharisees and the leaders of the day. In Matthew chapter 12, you have a story where Jesus is teaching on the Sabbath. It's some Sabbath day things that Matthew records, and so the first one that he mentions is that he's going through grain fields and his disciples were hungry, and they begin to pick the heads of grain, and so you have that, and the Pharisees are trying to find some flaw, and Jesus kind of rebukes them and gives kind of an explanation for where that comes from. And then he says he's Lord of the Sabbath. And then he leaves from there in verse 9. And this is what I really wanted to focus in on for goodness. He said he went into the synagogue and there was a man whose hand was withered. And they questioned Jesus, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day?" So they might accuse him. So we get like the reason the question comes from there. Matthew gives that to us. And Jesus said to them, "What man is there among you who has a sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will he not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? So then it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and it was restored like normal to the other. Jesus is showing that doing the right thing is always approved by God. He even says it that way. It is lawful to do good. Like, and he appeals to what they would do. I love this. He says, "Who among you, if you had a sheep and it fell in a pit, you wouldn't go get it out, because the sheep's going to die in the pit if you don't go get it out," right? This man has a hand that is withered up. It doesn't work right. And he is asking for help. He is here in the synagogue needing help. Is it wrong to help someone, to do right by others? And I think that's the point Jesus is making, right? It is always right to do. We hear that saying, right? It's always right to do right. It's always lawful to do good. And Jesus, he teaches the Pharisees, he rebukes them in this, but ultimately, this is who Jesus was. He was going to show what it means to be good. When someone is hurting or in need, goodness should compel us to act to their benefit. While we worship, we're talking about Sabbath here in this text in Matthew chapter 12, but what about for us in worship? It's important and it's commanded by God. It's something that we have to do. The Sabbath day was an instruction. It was God's divine instruction to rest on the Sabbath day. Worship is commanded by God for us, but it's worthless if it's not changing us to be God-like in the way that we view and treat others. If we're not using worship to be transformed, Paul in Ephesians chapter 4 says that we're coming together and we have apostles and prophets and teachers and all these things for the building up of the body. If we're not here to build each other to be like Jesus, then we're missing the point altogether. And I think that goes back to the story that Jesus tells with the Good Samaritan, is you have these worship leaders, this priest and this Levite, and they don't do the good thing, potentially because they were going to do another good thing, right? But right in that moment, they were missing what needed to be done for this other person. So when our neighbor is hurting or in need, we help without hesitation. Why? Because the goodness of God is growing in us by the Spirit. So we need to let our light shine in a way that people will see, Jesus says, our good works and glorify God.
Yeah, and there's tons of good works out there for us to do, for our neighbors, for the people that we find ourselves in contact with. I have a couple practical ways that we can do good to our neighbors. Obviously, there's way too many to list all of the good things that we can do, because when you factor in coworkers, cashiers, next door neighbors, all the people that we meet on even just like a daily basis, there's too many people and too many different circumstances to say, hey, here's the whole list. But here's I have a couple, and then Nick, I think you said you have a couple as well. First of all, if we are doing good, we're going to be fair to our neighbors. There's many proverbs about honest scales and not cheating your neighbor. Proverbs 16:11 is one of them. It says, "Honest balances and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are His concern." So back then, people would literally weigh things out in order to figure out, how much they needed to pay for something. So you could rig up your scale so that it looked like you were actually given more than you were and stuff like that. So if you did that one time, or over the course of 10 different business deals, you could make a lot of money, right? You could really come out well. But the Proverbs writer says, no, no, don't do that, because the Lord is concerned about your goodness, right? He's concerned about things being fair between you and your neighbor. He's not just looking for you to make a payday. He's looking for you to do right by the person that you're engaging in business with. And so I think for us, the idea that we get there is that we need to do right by our neighbors when we're engaging in business too, right? When we're selling something on Facebook Marketplace and we know that there's a dent on the bottom side of something, yeah, we need to let people know that, right? Because we're trying to do right by our neighbors in our business deals. If your primary goal is to make the most money, well, that's going to affect how you go about it, right? You're going to be trying to make sure that you hide anything, and make sure that this person doesn't see that or doesn't know about this other thing. But if your goal is to do right in the business deal, well, again, that just changes everything. And being that way puts you on good terms with God. So fairness is another way to just kind of have that mindset of, okay, what is the right thing to do here? If you're being fair, that's always going to be good. Another way is to look out for the less fortunate. We mentioned Jesus and the tables last week, where he comes in and he's flipping the money changing tables in the temple. The reason he did that was because they were taking advantage of the less fortunate. So in Jesus's goodness and seeking to do right by, especially by those people who were being taken advantage of, that's what it looked like. And so for us, it's right to look at others who are less fortunate than us and to seek to bring goodness into their lives. James, in James chapter 1 and verse 27, says, pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So that's what God is looking for when he's assessing us. He's like, hey, are you looking to do right by people who don't have this world's goods, who aren't just doing well in life, right? Because the world isn't really going to look at those people and look to do right by them, because they don't feel like they provide value. But we as Christians, we have to be looking to do right by them as well. Goodness to our neighbor. Sometimes it's just looking around us and saying, hey, look, what can I do? What can I do in this situation? What should I do in this situation? So those are the ones that I have. Nick, what are some practical forms of goodness that you see?
Yeah, just a couple here that I was thinking about. One, coming from Ephesians chapter 5, I think goodness is going to keep us from partnerships with people who are not living to God's good standard. And Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 5, and he's talking about the wrath of God coming up on the sons of disobedience. And then he goes on, he says in verse 7, therefore do not be partakers with them, for you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth. And so an aspect of our inability or the not living or associating with, being partakers with people who don't live by God's good standard, that comes from our understanding that God's standard is good and we want to live that in our lives. And so recognizing sin for what it is, it's a danger that leads to eternal separation from God. That comes from God's goodness and letting us know that, and it comes out of us as a good thing that we're doing and sharing. And then I think defending those who can't defend themselves. Cody mentioned helping those who can't help themselves, but I think also in this context here is, we're going to defend people who can't defend themselves. We're going to step in the way. I think Cody and I were having a conversation. We were prepping for this podcast talking about the goodness of God is standing in between someone who's trying to hurt someone else and protecting, defending the person who can't defend themselves. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, really, that's kind of what Jesus did when he drove the money changers out of the temple. We talked about that in the last episode, but I mean, I think this is a great time to bring it back in, where Jesus says, you're not going to make my Father's house a den of thieves. He's protecting the people who can't help themselves and defending them. And he's clearing out God's house in doing that. So God's goodness is integral to how we kind of determine how we treat others. And I think we've seen that. So a few questions to end us on. Is God's goodness becoming who you are? Is this who you are becoming? Can others see that goodness in you? What can we do during the next week to show more of God's goodness to your neighbor? And as always, we're trying to be like Jesus. Does our goodness reflect our good God?
Thank you for listening to the Honest Reflection Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We look forward to reflecting with you again next week.